She couldn't shake the image of Keanu Reeves sitting there, drenched, looking at her with something that wasn't anger, wasn't disappointment, just understanding. Why? Why had he reacted that way? Most people would have lashed out, embarrassed her in return, demanded consequences. But he hadn't. He had chosen kindness when she had given him nothing but disrespect. And that choice haunted her more than anything else. As she turned a corner, she noticed something up ahead. A figure leaning against a parked motorcycle, hands in his pockets, as if waiting for something. Her steps slowed, her breath caught. Keanu Reeves. He hadn't left after all. He was standing there, like he had known she would come this way. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached, every step feeling heavier than the last. Why was he still here? And what was he about to say? Sophie's breath hitched as she slowed her steps. Keanu Reeves stood just a few feet away, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable under the soft glow of the streetlights. The city buzzed around them, cars honking in the distance, footsteps echoing on the pavement, but at that moment, it felt like everything had gone quiet. Why was he still here? Her instincts told her to keep walking, to pretend she hadn't seen him, to avoid whatever conversation was about to happen. But her feet betrayed her, pulling her forward as if drawn by some invisible force. Keanu tilted his head slightly, studying her, and then in the same calm voice he had used before, he said, "I thought you could use some fresh air." Sophie swallowed hard. "You waited for me." He gave a small shrug. "I had a feeling you weren't ready to go home yet." She let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. He wasn't wrong. The weight of the night still pressed against her, making it impossible to imagine just walking through her apartment door and pretending nothing had happened. She glanced down, embarrassed. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything." For a moment, they just stood there. Sophie wanted to ask him why he was being so kind, why he hadn't reacted the way most people would have. But before she could, Keanu spoke again. "Do you know why I didn't get angry back there?" She looked up at him, unsure how to answer. She shook her head. "I didn't understand. Anyone else would have." She trailed off, unable to even finish the thought. Keanu exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Because I've been where you are. I know what it's like to have a breaking point." Sophie frowned, caught off guard. "You? But you're..." She stopped herself before saying something ridiculous like asterisk, "You're Keanu Reeves asterisk." He gave a small, knowing smile. "People assume I have it all together, but I had bad days. Really bad ones. I've been in places where I felt like the whole world was against me. And I've made mistakes too." She searched his face, looking for any sign that he was just saying this to make her feel better. But he wasn't. He meant it. A lump formed in her throat. "I didn't mean to." "I know," he said gently. "That's why I didn't react the way you expected." Sophie felt something tighten in her chest. This man, this asterisk incredibly famous asterisk man, was standing in front of her, telling her he understood, that he had felt what she was feeling now. But before she could process it, something unexpected happened. A voice from across the street called out, "Hey, that's him." Sophie turned just in time to see a small group of people pointing in their direction. Paparazzi. Within seconds, a couple of them rushed forward, cameras flashing. Sophie's stomach dropped. The restaurant incident had already been humiliating enough. Now this? Keanu barely reacted. He let out a small sigh, like this was something he had dealt with 1,000 times before. "I was hoping we'd have a little more time," he murmured under his breath. Sophie's pulse quickened. More time for asterisk what asterisk? The first paparazzo reached them, camera already up. "Keanu, what happened back there in the restaurant? We heard a waitress threw water at you. Is it true?" Another one chimed in, snapping more pictures. "Why didn't you press charges? Are you protecting her?" Sophie felt her body go rigid. Asterisk, this isn't happening asterisk. Keanu turned slightly, putting himself between her and the growing crowd. His voice was steady, calm, but firm. "There's nothing to report, just a misunderstanding." One of the reporters wasn't satisfied with that. "But why'd you leave so fast? Were you embarrassed?" Keanu shook his head. "No." He glanced at Sophie for a brief second before turning back to the reporters. "I left because there was no reason to make a bad moment worse." Sophie felt her breath hitch. It wasn't an excuse for what she had done, and she knew that. But somehow, the words made the weight in her chest feel a little lighter. The manager, looking increasingly uncomfortable with how things were unfolding, took another step forward. "Mr. Rees, I really think we should." Keanu stood up. The chair scraped against the floor, and for a moment, everyone tensed, unsure of what he was about to do. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a few crisp bills, and placed them on the table. The manager frowned. "Sir, you don't have to." Keanu turned to Sophie. "That should cover the meal," he said softly, "and a little extra for the trouble." Sophie's eyes widened. Her throat tightened again, but this time for a different reason. Keanu picked up his jacket, still damp from the water, and draped it over his arm. He glanced back at Sophie one last time and said, "Take care of yourself, okay?" Then, without another word, he walked toward the exit. The entire restaurant watched as he disappeared through the doors, leaving behind nothing but silence, and an unanswered question lingering in the air. Why had he reacted that way? Why wasn't he angry? And most importantly, what kind of person gets humiliated in front of a crowd and still chooses kindness? Sophie didn't have the answer, but she knew one thing for sure. She would never forget that moment. Sophie stood frozen, staring at the door long after Keanu Rees had disappeared into the night. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. The restaurant had started buzzing again, people whispering, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Others looked at her like she was the villain of the night. She could hear fragments of their conversations. "Did you see that? He just walked away. Why would she do that to him? I thought he'd flip out, but wow." Her hands trembled as she reached for the bills Keanu had left on the table. She didn't even count them. She just stared at them, feeling her throat tighten. Of all the ways she had imagined this night going, this wasn't one of them. The manager cleared his throat beside her. "Sophie," he said, his voice low but firm. "In my office. Now." Her stomach dropped. She knew this was coming. The moment she had thrown that water, she had sealed her fate. There was no way she was walking out of this with her job intact. She followed him through the narrow hallway behind the dining area, past the kitchen, where a few staff members glanced at her with wide eyes, and into the small, cramped office. The door clicked shut behind her. The manager sat down, rubbing his temples. For a long moment, he didn't say anything, and that silence was worse than being yelled at. Finally, he sighed. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" She swallowed. "Yes." He looked at her, waiting for more, but when she didn't say anything else, he shook his head. "Sophie, you threw water on a customer. Not just any customer, but one of the most respected actors in the world. This could ruin us." She clenched her jaw. "I know. You're lucky he didn't call the press, or worse, take legal action. Do you realize how much damage this could do?" "I wasn't thinking," she admitted. "It just happened." He leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "Why? Why did it happen?" She hesitated. She could say she was stressed, overworked, that she had snapped under pressure. But none of it justified what she had done. And yet, Keanu had walked away without anger, without making a scene. He had left her with nothing but a quiet kindness that somehow made her feel worse. "I don't know," she whispered. The manager sighed again, then leaned back in his chair. "I should fire you." Her heart pounded. She gripped the edge of her apron, bracing for the final blow. "But I won't." Her head snapped up. What? Because for some reason, Keanu Rees decided to be the bigger person tonight. And if he can walk away from this without holding a grudge, then maybe there's something for you to learn from it, too. Sophie didn't know what to say. She had been prepared for the worst. She had accepted it. But this felt even heavier somehow. "You're suspended," the manager continued. "A week, no pay. And when you come back, I expect you to be better. I expect you to learn from this." "Understood." She nodded, unable to speak. "Good. Now go home." She walked out of the office in a daze. The other waitstaff avoided her gaze as she grabbed her things from the back. Her shift was supposed to end in another 2 hours, but none of that mattered anymore. As she stepped outside, the cold air hit her like a wave. The city lights flickered, the streets still buzzing with life. She pulled her jacket tighter around her and started walking, her thoughts swirling like a storm. The answer was so simple, yet it shut down half of their questions. But Sophie knew it wouldn't stop them from twisting the story into something worse than it was. One of the reporters finally noticed her. "Wait, is this the waitress?" Panic shot through Sophie like lightning. She had never been in the spotlight before, never been on the other side of a camera like this. The reporter turned to Keanu. "Are you two friends? Why are you standing here talking to her?" Keanu took a step back, and Sophie felt his presence beside her like a shield. His voice was softer this time, but still strong. "Because people deserve second chances." The words sent a jolt through Sophie's chest. She didn't deserve his kindness, not after what she had done, but he had given it anyway. More cameras flashed, more voices called out. And then something shifted. One of the reporters turned to her directly. "Sophie, is it true you threw the water on purpose? Were you trying to get attention?" The question was like a slap to the face. Get attention. As if she had planned this, as if she had done it for some kind of sick publicity stunt. She shook her head furiously. "No, I." But before she could get another word out, Keanu did something that stunned her all over again. He put a hand on her shoulder, gentle but steady, grounding her. Then he turned back to the reporters, his expression unreadable. "You've got your story," he said. "Now let her go." There was something in his tone, something final. The reporters hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. And then, as if by some silent agreement, they slowly backed off. Sophie stood there, her heart racing, watching as the cameras lowered and the group started to disperse. It was over. Or at least should have been. But as she turned to Keanu, her stomach tightened. There was something in his expression, something unfinished. This wasn't over yet. Sophie's pulse was still racing as the last of the reporters finally disappeared down the street. The flashing cameras had stopped, the chaos had settled, but the weight of what had just happened still pressed down on her chest. She turned to Keanu, who was watching her with quiet concern. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Keanu studied her for a moment, then gave a small, almost amused smile, because sometimes people need someone to stand up for them. Sophie felt a lump in her throat. She had been bracing for humiliation, for the fallout from her actions, but instead, Keanu Reeves, the man she had just thrown water on, had shielded her from the worst of it. He had every reason to let her deal with the consequences alone, but he hadn't. Before she could say anything else, Keanu gestured toward the sidewalk. "Come on, let's walk." She hesitated, then fell into step beside him. The city felt quieter now, like the moment had paused just for them. For a while, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them in an oddly comfortable way. Then Keanu broke it. "You're not really angry at me." Sophie looked at him, startled. "What?" "You didn't throw that water at me because of me," he said simply. "It wasn't about the service or the tip or any of that." He glanced at her, his expression kind but knowing. "You were already carrying something heavy before I even walked in, weren't you?" Sophie felt her stomach twist. She wanted to argue, to say that it had been about the long shifts, the rude customers, the exhaustion, but she knew he was right. It wasn't just that. It had never been just that. She let out a slow breath. "Yeah." Keanu nodded, as if he had already known the answer. Do you want to talk about it? She hesitated. No one had asked her that in a long time, and she had never expected him to be the one to do it. But as they kept walking, the words started to spill out before she could stop them. I've been stuck, she admitted. In my job, in my life. I just feel like I've been running in place, and no matter how hard I try, nothing changes. She swallowed hard. And then tonight, everything just snapped. And I made the worst decision I could possibly made. Keanu was quiet for a moment before he said, "That's not true." She gave a dry laugh. "Really? Because from where I'm standing, it sure seems like it." Keanu stopped walking and turned to face her. The worst decision would have been walking away from this moment without learning anything. He studied her, his gaze steady. "But you're here. You're still figuring it out. That means you're not stuck. You're just in between." Sophie stared at him, unsure how to respond. No one had ever put it that way before. Keanu smiled slightly. "Besides, I've had worse things thrown at me." She let out a small laugh despite herself. "I doubt that." He raised an eyebrow. "You'd be surprised." The waitress felt her throat tighten. She wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain herself, but her voice wouldn't come out. Instead, she stood there, gripping the empty glass, staring at Keanu as if waiting for him to explode. But he didn't. He simply looked up at her, his deep brown eyes unreadable. And then he smiled. Not a smug smile. Not an awkward one. A genuine, warm smile, as if he had just been caught in a light drizzle and found the situation amusing. That smile only made the tension even stronger. Why wasn't he angry? Why wasn't he reacting the way any normal person would? The other diners, the staff, the manager, everyone was watching, waiting for the next move. The waitress's hands were shaking now. She had been having the worst night, running around non-stop, dealing with complaints, missed orders, rude customers. Everything had felt like too much. And then she had snapped. But she hadn't meant to snap like this asterisk. Finally, she swallowed hard and forced the words out. I'm so sorry," she stammered. "I don't know why I did that." Keanu tilted his head slightly, as if studying her. His smile faded just a little, replaced by something softer, something understanding. The manager, realizing this situation needed to be handled immediately, rushed forward. His face was red with panic. "Mr. Rees, I am so sorry for this. This is completely unacceptable. I'll take care of this immediately." He shot a sharp glance at the waitress, who shrank under his gaze. But Keanu held up his hand, stopping the manager before he could say another word. The entire restaurant went silent again. What was he going to say? Was he about to defend the waitress? Tell the manager to fire her, laugh it off and leave? No one knew. But whatever it was going to be unforgettable. The restaurant remained silent, every set of eyes locked on Keanu Reeves. Even the clinking of glasses and the low hum of conversation had vanished, as if the entire place was holding its breath. The manager stood there, waiting for Keanu's response, his forehead lined with tension. The waitress, still gripping the empty glass, looked like she wanted to disappear. Keanu exhaled softly, then leaned back slightly in his chair. His expression was unreadable. Not angry, not amused, just calm. Then he did something that no one expected. He looked directly at the waitress and asked, in the gentlest tone, "Rough night?" The words hit her harder than any scolding ever could. She blinked, caught off guard. Of all the things he could have said, that was the last thing she had expected. Her throat felt tight. She wanted to lie, to brush it off, to pretend she wasn't on the verge of breaking down. But under Keanu's steady gaze, something inside her cracked. "It's been a really bad night," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Keanu nodded, as if he understood more than she was saying. And maybe he did. Maybe he had seen that exhaustion before, the kind that builds up slowly until it spills over in ways you don't expect. The manager cleared his throat, stepping forward again. "Mr. Reeves, I assure you, This will not go unpunished. We value our guests and Keanu held up a hand again, cutting him off. It's okay, he said, still looking at the waitress. Really? The waitress swallowed hard. She knew it wasn't okay. What she had done was unprofessional, disrespectful, even cruel. But instead of making her feel worse, Keanu was doing the opposite. The people around them were still watching, waiting for some kind of dramatic resolution. Some looked disappointed that there wasn't going to be a scene. A few customers had their phones half raised, ready to record, but now they hesitated, unsure if this was worth capturing. The waitress glanced toward the entrance, half expecting security to come marching in. Maybe she should be fired. Maybe she deserved to be. But instead of fear, something else was creeping in, a deep, twisting shame. Keanu could have ruined her if he wanted to. A single complaint, a single post on social media, and her career would be over before it even properly started. But he wasn't doing that. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his arms on the table, and asked another question. What's your name? She hesitated. Sophie. Sophie, he repeated, as if committing it to memory. Then, after a pause, he said, You're not having a bad night because of me, are you? She shook her head quickly. No, it's not you. It's just everything. She hesitated, then admitted, I messed up an order earlier, and a customer yelled at me. Another one left without paying. I shouldn't have done that to you. I don't even know why I did. Keanu studied her for a moment, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. Then, in a voice just loud enough for her to hear, he said, You know, people have bad days, even good people. Sophie thought for a moment, then shook her head. I think I'll walk for a bit. Clear my head. Keanu nodded, understanding. Good choice. She took a step back, then hesitated. Keanu. He raised an eyebrow. She offered a small, genuine smile. Thanks for everything. He smiled back. Anytime. And with that, she turned and walked away, the city stretching out ahead of her. The night had started with a mistake. It could have ended with regret, but instead, it ended with something else entirely. A second chance.